Hello and welcome back to the still $0 production value channel for Yu-Gi-Oh content, especially around this Nationals format. Today we are going over the tier list for hand traps. There will be plenty left off this list, and if they're not on it, it's because they just don't matter. Without further ado, let's get started. So first we're going to start talking about Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. As everyone should know at this point, this card is just generically good. And it fell out of favor last format, because last format we needed hard turn skips. But now that the deck that really made it so you needed a hard turn skip, known as Super Heavy Samurai, practically doesn't exist, Ash Blossom is actually back to being very good. It hits the decks you need it to, being Kashtira and Branded, at very important spots. So because of that, Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring will be a solid, better play it tier. Next, we have Infinite Impermanence. Alrighty, so Infinite Impermanence is a fantastic trap because target negation is really powerful, and it's one of the few pits of hand trap that you can use into pretty much every deck, and also is important where it needs to be. You hit a unicorn with this, and generally speaking it feels good until they have the Kashtira Theosis in hand, in which case you just cry. But Impermanence is still a very good card because it has very important use cases. Previously mentioned, you can use it on Unicorn. You can use it on the Lubellion through the Branded line so that their second fusion doesn't go through, which puts them in a really bad position. It's very funny. It also happens to be a very good card when you go second and draw it, because you can still use it from your hand if it's the first thing you do. So in that kind of case, it is just a get rid of one monster effect on the board you don't want to deal with, whether you see it go first or go second. When you go first and you want to use it, you just set it. So no matter what, this card is pretty good to draw, and there are very good targets for it. This is another card you should be playing in your list if you have the space. Next, we're going to talk about more target negation. We have Effect Veiler. So Effect Veiler is in a really not very good spot for itself right now. Impermanence is great because it is monster negation, and that's always good. But it also has a lot more use cases and adaptability than Effect Veiler does. Effect Veiler has the benefit of being something that can be used multiple times per turn without the once per turn clause. The only problem with Effect Veiler is, one, there's two really. The first is that it's only during your opponent's main phase that you can really use this, so if you draw this as your top card, you're just going to have to stare at it in your hand and be like, man, I wish I had you earlier. The other problem with it is when Kashtira or Rizard hits the board, this card cannot be played. So with those two factors alone, being it's not as useful as Impermanence, and the fact that it has a hard counter in the Kashtira deck, that will push Effect Veiler into the I wouldn't be playing this category of cards. Next, we've got Dimension Shifter. So this card can't be played in every deck, but if your deck can play it, this card is absolutely insane. Dimension Shifter is good because it happens to turn off certain hand traps like Effect Veiler and Ghost Ogre, and you can use it on either player's standby phase. So if your deck doesn't care about the graveyard, this card's ridiculous because so many decks do. Not only that, it also turns off Droll and Lockbird, which is still a very good hand trap within the format because it is just that much of a turn skip. With that in mind, if you can play Dimension Shifter, if you can afford to get away with it, you should absolutely be playing this. It's such a good card. Next, we're going to talk about Ghost Belle. It's another one of the Ghost Girls. There's plenty, but the only ones that matter are Ash and Belle. And Ghost Belle is a bit of an interesting use case. It's useful in Branded, so that you don't get Gimmick Puppet locked. But the only problem with Branded is, if they play their line correctly, they'll end up having the Sanctifier plus the Mercurier. At that point, the Belle just isn't enough. It's very unfortunate. So despite being good in that matchup, sometimes it just doesn't matter. Another matchup that this is useful in, though, but this is always true, is going to be Labyrinth. Labyrinth has Big Welcome Labyrinth and Welcome Labyrinth. Big Welcome says from deck or graveyard, whereas Welcome says, I believe, hand or deck. So if you play both of the Ghost Girls in your list, you can just deal with Labyrinth by simply drawing them both, and then the Labyrinth player just has to cry. So it's very good in the Labyrinth matchup. And then in the Kashtira matchup, it is okay. You stop the Birth effect to Reborn, which is pretty nice. But if that's what we're using it on, we're probably in a very bad spot. Okay, like, by itself, this isn't good enough to have it in a turn. You'd want this with another hand trap at that point. And then as for Rogue, I mean, this hits the Gold Pride Punk deck a little bit, but not too much. I don't know if it hits much of anything else. It's still a good card to have because it does stop important things, because you cannot play against a Branded player once they have the Gimmick Puppet lock on you. At that point, it's over. So having the ability to stop that is valuable, but this isn't a card that is useful for every matchup or even by itself. So if you're going to play this card, I believe this is in a side deck tier of cards. Next, we have the recently limited Gamma. So Gamma's in a very interesting place. Everyone knows that the card and its effect is ridiculous, and if you still have an Stardust Synchro Dragon, then you can still make Baron just by resolving Gamma. So that alone is extremely powerful. I mean, obviously there's the downside of, well, there's one of this and there's one of the brick. So you're going to be drawing the brick just as often as seeing Gamma. And to that point, that's actually really big. So if you can run a discard like Runic can for the driver, then this is pretty good. Or in decks where you need to resolve a particular effect, a spell effect more than likely, that summons from deck or that searches, then Gamma is still also very good for you. It kind of fills the crossout slot, but it also has utility where if you go second, you can force on Rise Heart, you resolve Gamma, and now you've got a Baron into Kashtira just because a Rise Heart mandatory effect went off. The effect is always going to be great, but due to the inability of you being able to see it and the ratios of it, I'd say if you're going to play this card, it would have to be in your main deck, but I wouldn't suggest playing it for most people. So I'd put this in the, maybe play it, but if you really, really want to resolve that one spell. Alternatively, you could play it with Epsilon or Delta, the trap and spell versions of this card by itself. And the Epsilon, I expect to actually see some play because people were very scared of Labyrinth after watching Eradicator Epidemic Virus completely ruin the Kashtira player's hand in the German Nationals, which, by the way, if you haven't seen, is fucking hilarious.
Nicht mehr Zaubercharakter, es ist ein feierlicher Schlag. Okay, und jetzt gucken wir uns die Hand an von Tom. Wie viele Zauberkarten sind darin? Eine Werf, ein Planet, ein Prosperity, ein Es sind nur Zauberkarten fast nur Zauberkarten. Die letzte Karte wird abgeworfen. Und die wird gepoppt mit Lovely.
Alrighty, now that I've shown you that blowout, I mean, maybe you do want to play the Epsilon at that point. But the next hand trap we're going to go over is Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit. This is an interesting hand trap in that it's searchable in certain strategies, so it's worth playing. Like, if you're playing Punk specifically, you can search this. So as a one-of in that strategy, it just makes sense. Unfortunately, there aren't that many good Ogre targets in the current format. Every field spell that's in the format currently, they will all search on activation, so you can't Ogre it since the card wasn't on field before activation, which is really unfortunate. So we're really limited on what we want to use this for. We could try and use it into the Runic field spell, but the problem is then you're sitting on, or they have a Hugin out, and all of a sudden your Ogre's dead. You can't do anything about it. The Birth, hitting Birth is okay. The only problem with hitting Birth is they've already developed their whole board if they're using that effective Birth. I guess if Cash Planet is up and you really need to protect that card you have on field, you can always discard it. But this happens to have, Send to Graveyard, which leads me to my next point. This happens to have the same problem that Effect Veiler does. That being that you can't use it under Macrocosmos. So for that reason alone, this is a card I would not suggest playing in your list unless you can search it and you want to search it. Because even in the Punk strategy, you might not want to play it just because it's dead sometimes and not that impactful other times. Now onto the big hitters. We've got two more. So the first of the next two cards is going to be Nibiru the Primal Being. And now, while initially I've been off Nibiru, and I'm honestly a Nibiru hater, I haven't been liking playing Nibiru since you draw it as a 6th card and all of a sudden everything doesn't matter and it's very easy to play around or telegraph. So I've been against Nibiru, but Nibiru does something important. So since Nibiru activates on your opponent's turn, if you're playing into the branded player and they have down the line that gets them the Mercurier as a monster negate, you can burn that monster negate on their turn, and then when they go to bring back the Gimmick Puppet off of the Sanctifier Dragon, you can negate that with Bell, and they won't have an answer for it. Nibiru is also pretty good into Kashtira now, because Kashtira, if they want to make a board worth anything, they have to put, or they have to go into a bigger combo, especially if you hit them with an Imperm somewhere or an Ash somewhere. They have to make a very awkward board. And so very often, if they want a board worth its salt, they will play into Nibiru. So two of the biggest hitters are hit by Nibiru, which is pretty valuable. Especially if your deck has a hard time going second, this might be something to put into your main deck. Unfortunately, there are a few decks where this doesn't do anything into, those of course being Sprite and any of its variants with the Runic and then either Live Twin or for hire, as well as Labyrinth. Because of that, it having very good matchups in some places and very bad in others, it's probably correct to put Nibiru in the put it in your side category of cards. Because this is something you absolutely want access to, but it's not something that's good into every deck in the format. And the final hand trap we'll be going over in today's overview is Droll and Lockbird. So Droll and Lockbird was probably the most important hand trap last format because of Super Heavy Samurai. But it's really fallen out of favor since Super Heavy has also fallen out of favor. It still has its turn skipping effect more or less if you use it into certain decks, especially Gold Pride Punk. That deck cries. They make bounce 4 pass and that's about it. But you use this into Kashtira, depending on what their hand looks like, this is very effective or not effective. If they start with Kashtira Theosis, if they start with the Pressured Planet Wraithsoth, right? The Kashtira planet. If they start with the Kashtira planet, then this is probably the best card you could have seen. If they start with Unicorn, yeah, no, this does nothing. So it's really unfortunate in that case. And then into Branded, it's another one of those 50-50 scenarios. If they start Branded, or not even Branded opening, there aren't many of the scenarios where this is fantastic. However, if you are worried about the line of play that gets them both Sanctifier and Mercurier, personally I'm very scared of that line, this is actually pretty good because they'll have searched before they get to search the Mercurier, which means they either have to have it in hand or they don't have the negate. And then this just always hits Rogue. The Rogue decks cannot play around Troll, otherwise they wouldn't be Rogue. For that reason, this is a card you could absolutely play in your side deck, though you don't have to. Obviously, you don't have to play any of these in your side deck, but this is a card where if you have 3 last slots you want to fill, this is a pretty good last hand trap to put in. But all in all, I think it's pretty obvious at this point. If you are going to play some hand traps, ones that need to be in your main deck, you have to have at least 6 slots, because you have to play Ash and you have to play Imperm if you plan on playing a more or less competitive deck. If you have extra slots, you could put any of these 4 in your main deck, though I would suggest between Nibiru and Ghost Bell, as they'll have the highest effectivity and the highest, breadth of decks that it can hit. Whereas Droll and Gamma is just really 50-50. So if you have a discard, this is fine. But if you don't, it feels really bad. And then Droll has its really weak matchups, which unfortunately are the top decks that we're really going to have to build for. And then finally, if you're playing Effect Veiler and Ghost Ogre, stop. I mean, I don't know what you're doing, but unless you can search it, so don't come after me. But I wouldn't do it unless you could search it exactly. With that in mind, this should hopefully prepare you for the Nats in not even a week at this point. So get to grinding, boys. We have some labbing to do.